Barbed wire stretched across the horizon, its jagged shadows cutting into the dust of a forgotten compound on Luzon in the Philippines. August 1945, inside the narrow barracks. Women sat pressed against the iron bars, their bodies frail, their eyes hollow. Some were Japanese, others Korean and Chinese, all caught in the machinery of an empire that had abandoned them. They whispered words that clung to the silence like dying embers. "We will die here." That single phrase, spoken in trembling voices, carried not only despair but resignation. For in their hearts, the war had long erased the concept of rescue. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and mildew, remnants of nights where survival meant nothing more than enduring one more sunrise. Each woman carried a different scar, some visible on their faces, others etched deep into memory. They had been promised food and safety in exchange for loyalty. But the reality had been degradation in the name of comfort service. Now, with the Pacific Front collapsing and Japanese guards vanishing into the jungle, the women remained imprisoned in a silence more terrifying than the daily brutality abandonment. Beyond the gates, the world was shifting. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki earlier that month, and Japan's surrender was imminent. Yet in remote camps like this, no surrender had yet arrived. Soldiers melted into the countryside, leaving behind the evidence of their crimes. For the women inside, there was no sense of geopolitics, only the immediate terror of hunger gnawing at their stomachs and fever running through their veins. The whisper of "we will die here" was not melodrama. It was calculation. They had seen bodies carried out of the barracks only days before. Some had kept diaries hidden in straw mats, recording names, dates, and small details of bird nesting in the rafters. A brief smile exchanged in the dark, a torn piece of cloth used as a pillow. Such fragments were the only rebellion left proof that they had once lived as human beings. On the morning of August 19th, the camp was quieter than usual. A faint vibration carried through the ground, like distant thunder. The women tensed, expecting the sharp shouts of Japanese guards or the cruel crack of a whip. Instead, the sound came from beyond the wire, the low rumble of a truck engine, foreign to their ears. Dust rose over the outer road, shimmering in the sun. They pressed against the bars, hearts pounding with equal parts dread and impossible hope. If new soldiers came, would they be executioners or saviors? The uncertainty twisted like a knife, yet even in their exhaustion, one woman muttered under her breath, "Listen, that is not the sound of death, it is something else." It was the beginning of a moment history would rarely record, a moment not of battlefield triumph or atomic fire, but of frail hands clinging to hope as iron gates trembled under the weight of change. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? The sound came first, a metallic groan, stretched and reluctant, as if history itself resisted the moment. The women flinched when they heard it. It was not the bark of an order in Japanese, not the whip slicing the air, but something far stranger, the slow, grinding squeal of iron hinges. The heavy camp gate, rusted and scarred by years of use, began to shift. They stared at one another in disbelief. For months. That gate had been their horizon, the border between life and death, the boundary that defined their captivity. And now, with each painful creak, it betrayed the certainty they had clung to that no one would ever come. A shaft of sunlight broke across the compound floor as the doors parted. For women accustomed to the dim interior of barracks, the brightness was almost blinding. They raised trembling hands to shield their eyes. Some pressed their faces against the bars, convinced this must be a trick, that perhaps the Japanese guards were preparing some cruel punishment. But there was no alarm bell, no gunshots, no shouted command. Instead, the only sound was the ancient moan of metal, echoing like a dirge across the yard. Later accounts from U.S. Army personnel in the Philippines would describe these gates as ordinary, simple steel frames bolted into wooden posts. Yet, to the women inside, they might as well have been the walls of a fortress. They had watched countless hours pass in their shadows, waiting for the footsteps of captors. The absence of those footsteps on this day was more terrifying than their presence had ever been. One woman, identified in later records as a Korean survivor named Sun Hee, pressed her palm against her chest. Her breathing was ragged, her ribs visible through her thin uniform. She whispered to those beside her, "If this is death, let it come quickly." Another, a Japanese girl, barely 16, shook her head fiercely. "No, it is something else." The words carried like sparks through the group, igniting a fragile flame of anticipation. Outside, the dust settled into beams of light. The gate, once a barrier, now became a stage. The women leaned forward, holding their breath, as though the universe itself had paused to watch. The irony was unbearable. This very gate had been slammed shut countless times by their oppressors. It had echoed with the laughter of guards and the cries of the broken. And now, its reluctant swing was a sound of rupture, the sound of a system collapsing under the weight of war. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. Its melody was fragile, cutting through the heavy silence of the yard. That simple sound, ignored in ordinary times, now felt like a prophecy. What lay beyond the opening was unknown, but in that instant, the women realized that the silence of waiting had ended. The gate had opened, and with it, the certainty of their death sentence dissolved like dust in sunlight. The first shadows appeared on the ground before the figures themselves came into view. Broad silhouettes stretched across the dusty yard, and the women recoiled instinctively, expecting the return of their tormentors. For years, boots at the gate had meant pain, the sting of a whip, the barked order to line up, the humiliation of being inspected like property. But these shadows moved differently, slower, heavier, carrying no menace in their rhythm. Then they saw the uniforms, olive drab, marked with the unmistakable white star of the United States Army. The women froze. It was not the cruel swagger of Japanese gendarmes, but the cautious steps of American soldiers, rifles slung but not raised, faces grim yet strangely gentle. One survivor would later write in her diary, "I thought they were ghosts." No enemy would walk with such quietness. No captor would carry their weapon as though ashamed of it. For women who had been taught to expect hatred, the sight was incomprehensible. At the front walked Sergeant Robert Daniels, a farm boy from Iowa who had crossed oceans he never expected to see. He had been told only that the camp held prisoners, but the reality before him stopped him in his tracks. Behind the wire, skeletal women stared back at him, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked. He removed his helmet without thinking, lowering it to his chest, as though in the presence of something sacred. His men hesitated too. Private First Class Thomas Reed whispered, "God, they're just girls." His voice trembled, carrying more shock than any battlefield had given him. The squad had fought through jungles, traded fire with Japanese defenders, buried comrades in shallow graves, but nothing had prepared them for this silent yard of broken humanity. The women did not rush forward. They clung to the bars, wary, torn between hope and fear, for so long. Their enemy had been defined in propaganda as cruel, faceless, inhuman. Yet here stood the very men they had been told to despise, and they carried not chains, but the possibility of release. One soldier reached into his pack and pulled out something small, a bar of chocolate wrapped in silver foil. He held it out toward the fence, uncertain if the gesture would be accepted. On the other side, a trembling hand extended, hesitant at first, then with sudden desperation, fingers brushed against fingers, and for a heartbeat, the war seemed to pause. The act was almost unbearably ordinary, an American soldier offering rations, a starving woman reaching for them. But in its ordinariness lay its power. This was not the cruelty they expected. This was not vengeance. This was the first breath of freedom. As the gate opened wider, the women pressed closer. They could not yet believe in liberation, but they could not deny the evidence of their eyes. The footsteps that entered their prison did not come with whips or shouts. They came with a silence heavy with mercy. The moment came with words so simple they seemed impossible. An interpreter stepped forward, his voice steady though his hands shook from the weight of history. In Japanese, then in Korean. He spoke, "You are free now." At first, there was silence. The women blinked, uncomprehending. Freedom was a word that had vanished from their vocabulary long ago. They had known only orders, confinement, and humiliation. To be told they were free was like being asked to believe the sky could fall. Then the silence broke. A low cry rose from the barracks, a sound not of fear but of release. One woman clutched her chest and collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Another pressed her forehead to the dirt, tears spilling into the dust. Others simply stared upward, mouths open, as if searching the heavens for confirmation that this was real. Sergeant Daniels, who had seen men die screaming on jungle battlefields, later confessed in a letter home, "I never thought I would see tears like that." They cried as though the earth itself had lifted from their backs. The soldiers looked at one another, their training useless in the face of such raw emotion. Some averted their eyes, ashamed by the suffering laid bare before them. Others wept quietly, their rifles forgotten against their shoulders. The campyard became a place of human collapse, not in defeat, but in the unsteady beginning of healing. One survivor, a Japanese woman named Haruko, whispered between sobs, "Enemies. They called us enemies. And yet they opened the gate." The irony was crushing. The same empire that had enslaved them had abandoned them, while the so-called enemy had returned what their own had stolen: dignity. The emotional release swept through the camp like a wave. Women clung to one another, their cries echoing off the bamboo walls. For years, their voices had been muted by fear, but now, sobbing was its own declaration: "We are still alive." Private Reed wrote in his journal that evening, "I have fought the Japanese for 2 years, but today I saw their victims. Today, I saw that freedom can be louder than gunfire." When they cried, it was the sound of history breaking. The image of women falling to the ground, clutching the soil beneath them, would linger in the minds of those soldiers long after the war ended. For the survivors. It was the first time in years that tears could mean something other than pain. They cried because the gate was open. They cried because their captors were gone. They cried because strangers in enemy uniforms had given them back the impossible choice. The truth emerged slowly, like smoke rising from ruins. The American officers who inspected the camp filed precise reports: overcrowded wooden barracks, absence of proper sanitation, women reduced to skin and bone. In one record from August 22, 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Corps noted that more than half of the liberated women suffered from untreated infections, while others bore injuries that would never fully heal. These were not prisoners of war in the legal sense, but human beings stripped of their status and used as instruments. Military intelligence soon pieced together the scope of the system across Asia, from the Philippines to Burma to Korea. Historians estimate more than 200,000 women had been forced into the machinery of comfort stations. It was a number so vast that it became almost incomprehensible. And yet, inside this one camp, the figures were made real. Each woman carried a story of nights stolen, of dignity denied, of names erased. The contrast was devastating. Japanese soldiers had treated these women as consumable tools, discarding them when they weakened. Now, American medics bandaged wounds and distributed food rations: rice, bread, powdered milk. Some of the women hesitated to eat, convinced it was a cruel trick, while others devoured the food with trembling hands. Lieutenant Henry Wallace, tasked with overseeing the relief operation, recorded a chilling detail in his field notes when given soap. Many stared at it blankly. They no longer remembered what it meant to wash freely. That small observation spoke louder than statistics. It revealed how captivity had eroded even the memory of ordinary life among the soldiers. Gossip spread like wildfire. Some whispered of guards who had fled in shame before the Americans arrived. Others spoke of the eerie quiet that hung over the camp, as if the very soil knew what horrors had taken place there. One medic recalled how the survivors would flinch violently whenever boots struck gravel, conditioned by years of beatings. The numbers, cold and factual, could not contain the human weight. 2 women had died in the week before liberation, their bodies buried in shallow graves behind the barracks. Their absence was felt like a shadow among the survivors, proof that freedom had come too late for some. And yet, in the eyes of those who still lived, there flickered something defiant. The simple act of eating, of touching the soap, of lying down on blankets without fear, these were rebellions against the system that had sought to erase them. For the Americans, the statistics became evidence to submit to higher command. For the women, they were chains broken one by one. But here's the question that lingers for us. The viewers of history: are numbers enough to carry the weight of human suffering? Or do we need to remember the trembling hands, the whispered thanks, The eyes that could not believe freedom had a taste. I want to hear from you if you had stood at that gate. Would you have offered a ration or simply turned away? In the days following liberation, the Americans combed through the camp for evidence documents, rosters, anything that could explain the machinery of suffering they had witnessed. What they found were fragments, charred scraps pulled from the ashes of a fire hastily lit by retreating guards. Among the remains lay letters never sent, messages written by women to families they had not seen in years. One surviving fragment, translated later by military linguists, read, "Mother, I dream of our village in the spring. If I do not return, please forgive me for leaving without goodbye." The edges were singed, the ink smeared, but the voice was unmistakably human. Another bore only a single line in Korean. "Tell my sister I sang our song until the end." These scraps traveled back to headquarters as evidence, but for the soldiers who handled them, they were more than artifacts. Private Reed wrote in his journal, "I touched the paper, and it felt like touching the ghost of someone still alive." The women themselves clung to small objects recovered from the rubble: a torn comb, a strip of cloth embroidered with a name, a hairpin hidden in straw. Each object was a tether to an identity they had been forced to bury. When shown one such fragment of a letter, Haruko, the young Japanese survivor, placed it to her lips and whispered, "This is me." It was as if she had been waiting for years to remember she had a self beyond captivity. The discovery spread whispers among the American guards too. Around campfires, men spoke in low voices, struggling to reconcile what they had seen. One sergeant muttered that he would rather storm 100 bunkers than walk again through that barracks of silence. Another admitted he could not sleep without hearing the cries of women clutching letters to their chests. Military reports filed these details away under the dry language of morale and psychological impact. But the truth was deeper. The fire meant to erase evidence had failed. The ashes still spoke. Numbers again surfaced across Asia. Allied intelligence confirmed that hundreds of such camps had operated, many burning their records as Japan collapsed. Yet, even without the ledgers, the women's testimonies and the fragments of letters carried the truth forward. And so we ask ourselves, how much of history is preserved not in grand monuments, but in scraps of paper, in whispers that survive flames? Could you, if handed one half-burned letter, feel the presence of the life behind it? For the women, those scraps were more than memory. They were proof that their voices had not been completely silenced. For the Americans, they became a reminder that victory was not only measured in territory gained, but in lives whose stories refused to vanish. Liberation did not end at the gate. It began there, and then it followed the women like a shadow into the rest of their lives. When the Americans escorted the survivors away from the compound, some walked unsteadily, clinging to soldiers' arms, while others looked back at the barracks as though part of themselves had been left behind. Freedom carried its own weight. What awaited them outside was not always kindness, but questions, shame, and silence. For the Japanese survivors, the return home was complicated. They had been betrayed by the very empire that claimed to protect them. Their families often did not know, or did not want to know, what had been endured. Diaries and later interviews revealed that some women were greeted not with embraces, but with lowered eyes, as if their suffering had stained them. The cruel paradox of liberation was that it restored their humanity in the eyes of strangers, yet sometimes erased it among their own. Korean and Chinese women faced an equally bitter fate. They returned to homelands scarred by war and occupation, only to discover that society was reluctant to hear their stories. In villages, whispers labeled them dishonored, when in truth they had been victims of a machine far larger than themselves. The gates had opened, but stigma followed like an invisible chain. American soldiers, too, carried the memory. In letters and testimonies years later, some admitted that they never forgot the sight of women collapsing in tears. One veteran told his grandson that whenever he heard the squeal of a rusty hinge, he remembered the day the gate swung open and a yard full of broken voices began to weep. The war had left scars on both liberators and liberated, though of very different kinds. The symbolism of that moment spread beyond the camp for the United States. The rescue of enslaved women became a quiet victory, not celebrated in parades, but remembered in private conscience. The power of America's triumph was not only in the mushroom cloud over Japan or in the steel of battleships, but in the fragile act of restoring dignity where it had been stolen. One survivor's testimony captured the essence of that paradox. We awaited death, but the Americans opened the gate and gave us life. That line, recorded in the archives, forced even hardened generals to pause. It was not strategy, nor weaponry, but mercy that gave meaning to that victory. The gate itself became a symbol. Etched in memory, though the camp eventually crumbled, it represented a threshold between two worlds, one of captivity and silence, the other of possibility and voice. To step across it was to leave behind a graveyard of stolen years. And so America held its head high, not only because it had defeated an empire, but because, in that moment, it had proven that victory could also mean humanity. The gate swung open, and with it, a legacy was born of compassion stronger than cruelty, of freedom louder than fear. The image of that gate remains rusted iron trembling on its hinges, sunlight spilling into a yard of silence. It is not the kind of image often found in textbooks or victory parades, yet it carries the weight of a century, for in that instant, the end of the Pacific War was not only measured in treaties signed or weapons laid down, but in the fragile bodies of women who had survived the unimaginable. History often remembers numbers: 200,000 women enslaved, hundreds of camps scattered across Asia, a war that claimed tens of millions of lives. But behind those numbers were voices that trembled, eyes that refused to close, letters that never reached their destinations. When American soldiers opened the gates, they did not only free prisoners, they released stories that might otherwise have been buried in ash. Some survivors lived long lives, carrying the memory like a scar that never faded. Others died young, unable to reconcile the weight of stigma with the gift of survival. And yet, all of them, by enduring, left us a lesson. That lesson is not about vengeance or conquest, but about the fragile thread of humanity that can persist even in the darkest times. One veteran recalled, decades later, that he still dreamed of the sound of rivet guns from factories back home, but louder still were the cries he heard in that camp yard. Those cries reminded him and remind us that war is not only fought in the clash of armies, but in the quiet places where dignity is stolen and, if mercy prevails, returned. Perhaps that is why the gate matters, because it did not simply open to release captives. It opened to show the world that freedom, however delayed, can still arrive, and that when it does, it demands not only celebration, but remembrance.